Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about the 3 best baits that you should be throwing for February bass fishing to make sure you're catching the most amount of bass possible this month. So stay tuned and let's get right into it. So February is an interesting month to choose bass fishing baits for because it's very weather dependent. While the same baits that worked for January bass fishing will work all in February, which I'll also link that video at the end of this one if you want to check that out, I'm going to go for if we had a warmer spring than usual. Up here in the north, February, we're still frozen in, but a lot of times in the south, it can start getting just a little bit warmer this time of year, especially towards the end of the month, and those fish will start eating again. They'll start feeling spring coming. They're not going to go start flooding the creeks and going back there, but they might start setting up on the first point in a creek or something like that to start working their way to where they want to eventually spawn, and you'll be able to catch them on some different baits than we talked about for January. Mostly reaction baits, which is more fun to fish for my opinion. So we're going to talk about some reaction baits today. And while the water is still cold this time of year, these reaction baits that I'm going to pick out for today's video will work down to the coldest of water temperatures. I've caught fish on all of these baits all the way down to about 42-degree water temp. So these will still work even if your water's very cold, and the warmer weather you have, the warming trends and stuff like that, only the better these baits will do. So let's start with number 1, which is actually going to be the jerkbait. So the jerkbait will allow you to fish either parallel with those steep walls and fish for suspended fish that are hanging out around those walls, or you can fish this jerkbait over an actual point and cover water across a point doing so. Now when you pick a jerkbait for this time of year, this is very important. You need to pick the right jerkbait, because if you pick one with too much action, it will actually keep you from catching as many fish as you possibly can. And what I mean by that, I'm not going to say you have to go out and buy a Megabass Vision 110 as everyone thinks you do. I'm going to show you a couple options in addition to that that will actually work very well. The key to a good jerkbait for winter bass fishing is a very slim profile right there. What I'm talking about is you want your bait to have flat sides on each side of the bait. You want the bait to be very skinny overall and not have any big bulbous areas on the bait. You want it to just be a very slim looking streamlined bait. If you have one like an X-Wrap or a Lucky Craft pointer where they have the bulbous sides on them and they kind of have a little flare around the edge, that's going to cause that jerkbait to have way too much action. Even if you twitch it really slow, it has a sharper dart to it. My recommendation almost right now is just to pick a jerkbait that has 3 hooks on it. It's not that the 3rd hook is going to do anything for you, but those 3 hooked jerkbaits are typically much more slender and narrow and have what's like a gliding action to it rather than a snap and dart, and that gliding action is more natural to what these dying shad or cold shad look like this time of year. So some of my favorite options to fish in that narrower profile bait is going to be obviously the Megabass Vision 110 and 110 Plus 1. Those are excellent jerkbaits. If you cannot afford those, here's a couple other options that I like as well, like the Lucky Strike Rick Clunn RC STX jerkbaits. They're very similar to a Megabass, but only come in a shallow diving and not many colors, but they perform very similar. They have that gliding action rather than a snapping action to it. You might just have to change the hooks out a little bit to get it to actually weigh properly to suspend, because that is another very important thing this time of year. You want your bait to either suspend or sink very slowly, so this is a good choice as well. The other choice that I like are like the Rapala Shadow Wrap Deeps. They have a very gliding action to it. They work very well, and they have, for perch specifically, if you fish around smallmouth, the actual perch color of the Rapala Shadow Wrap Deep is the best one that I've found. It mimics a perch amazing. I really love this color, even over some of the Megabass perch options. And then a couple other options. One that I don't have is the Lucky Craft Slender Pointer, not the regular pointer. If you get the Slender Pointer, it's more narrow, as it says. It has the 3 hooks, and it has that gliding action to it. And even this Strike King jerkbait right here, the Strike King KVD jerkbaits, they're very slim too. They have a little bit more dart to it than some of the other ones, but these jerkbaits will work just as well in the wintertime. If you can get them weighted properly. I do have trouble trying to get these to suspend sometimes, especially in colder water when it's more dense. But if you can get these to suspend properly, these actually work awesome in the wintertime as well. And then as for color options when it comes to jerkbaits, I keep it very simple. I either use all white or like a bone color, sexy shad, something like that. That color works awesome when the water's just a little bit stained. And then if you have clear water, I use something natural looking, translucent, like a Pro Blue or something that you can just see through the bait and has a very natural presentation to it. My second choice for February bass fishing is going to be a follow-up to the jerkbait. If the jerkbait is working, this bait will also be working, and that is the Alabama rig. Obviously, you're going to have to follow your rules within your state, how many hooks you can have on it, if you can fish this at all, and if you're fishing a tournament, you may not even be allowed to fish this. But it is a killer bait for February bass fishing. It works in those same areas. If you're fishing a point that's over 20 feet of water, you can throw it out, let it sink 10 feet down and fish it suspended. You can throw it out there, let it sink all the way to the bottom and fish it on the bottom. You can fish it parallel with those steep banks that those fish will hang on, the bluff walls and everything like that this time of year. And it just mimics exactly what these fish are trying to feed on, which is schools of shad, as the crawfish can still be in hibernation this time of year. So a lot of these schools of shad are cold, they ball up tight, and they start to die off this time of year. Especially when that water gets really, really cold. The unhealthy ones, this is getting towards the end of winter, they can't make it anymore and they start to die off. That's why that jerkbait darting profile works really well. That's why this will work really well. You have a school of shad here, and you got this one straggler off the back. It kind of looks like he might be dying off, hanging on for life. They come up and just whack that one. That's why I make this one the target. You can see I have some chartreuse on the tail here. You could put a bigger bait in that section that hangs back from the rest of the school, a different color, anything like that will draw a target to your bait. But in February, I keep it really, really simple with my A-rigs. So I like to use the Umbrella Flash Mob Junior. It performs the best for me, and it has a couple little blades on there that act as teasers and just draw a little more attention to the rig. I will use this in stained water. Typically this doesn't work as well in muddy water, but a nice stain, this works really well. And in clear water, I'll still use it with the blades unless there's a lot of pressure. If you know a ton of guys are out there chucking the A-rig, that is when I'll actually go to an A-rig without blades at all. It just has a little more stealth approach to it, just the swim baits only, and it looks a little bit different than what everybody else is throwing. I found a lot of people, I mean me included, just like to have the blades on the A-rig. So if you have everyone chucking A-rigs with blades and you throw one without, it could be just different enough to get you some extra bites on the A-rig. The other thing I really like to do to my A-rigs is actually downsize my baits. A lot of people like to fish the 3.8s or even the 4.2 Kitex on their A-rig, and it gives it a big profile and it really looks like a school of shad. But I've found if I go to the 3.3s, they're still big enough to put a jig head on them. They're not like the 2.8s, which are really, really baby swim baits and they wouldn't work very well on here. They're kind of a perfect cross between a 2.8 smaller profile and a 3.8. They're right in the middle. They are perfect for on an A-rig, and they give it a much more finesse presentation. That's actually why I use the Flash Mob Junior. I use the Flash Mob Junior with these smaller blades, and I use some smaller jig heads and some smaller baits. My profile is much smaller, but it gets me a lot more bites because it's just a small compact ball of shad, and those smaller baits and blades are a little bit different from what everybody else is throwing out there, especially when the A-rig bite is hot. And when it comes to color selection on my swim baits for my A-rig, again, I'm keeping this very, very simple. I'm going to use an all white in stained water, and if I have clear water, I'm going to use a natural shad color. My favorite one is electric shad, but I've used rainbow shad, super shad, pro blue, anything like that that just looks like a plain shad color will work awesome on your A-rig. Those are the only two color swim baits that I will throw on here, and I just make it look like a ball of shad. That's all you're trying to do. Make it look very natural. The more you can match the hatch, the better with this rig. And the last bait that I like to fish for February fishing, this works exceptional if you have a warming trend or sunny days that heat up the rocks on the bank. That's going to be a crankbait. This is going to work on those shallower points. It's going to work on those bluff walls that are a little bit shallower where you can run this up there actually on the rocks, and those bass are up there getting heat. But there's a couple key things you need to pay attention to when you're picking your crankbait for this time of year. The biggest key to the correct February crankbait is flat sides. Now the second thing that I really like in my February crankbaits is going to be balsa wood only, but if you can only get plastic ones, they will still work. I just choose not to use those until the water gets into the low 50s, like 50 to 53 range. If the water's under 50 degrees into the 40s, I like a balsa wood crankbait with no rattles in it. You want them silent, and you just want them with that very tight wiggle. The balsa wood wiggles a lot tighter than a plastic crankbait. It has a much better action for the cold water time that you're fishing, specifically in February. So some of my favorites here are going to be the Rapala Shad Wrap. This is an awesome bait. This is the one that I'll fish down to the coldest of water temperature. Literally, if there's no ice on the water, you can throw this crankbait and catch fish. It works amazing. So I fish the size 5 and the size 7. Those two sizes will cover all the depth ranges you need. A couple of my other favorites, specifically if the water's a little bit warmer, up in that like 47 to 50 degree range, is going to be the DT series. Since they have this bulbous body to them, they do have a little bit wider wiggle than the Shad Wrap, so they won't work in as cold of water, but they'll work probably as low as about 45 degrees. And I will fish the DT6 for if they're really up there shallow, a lot of sun on those rocks. And then I'll even fish the DT10, and the new DT8 would work awesome as well. Those baits get out just a little bit deeper on those colder days, less sun out, and can get those fish that are hanging a little bit deeper off those bluff walls or on those points. And then my final crankbait that I'll fish in this cold water month with the balsa wood flat sides is going to be the Ott's Garage Rapala crankbait. I pretty much fish exclusively Rapala, as you can tell, in that cold water time. This one doesn't come into play until about 47, 48 degree water temperature though, because this is a very shallow diving bait. So I tend not to fish this one until the waters warm up just a little bit, or you have a lot of sunny days. I will often opt for the Shad Wrap or the DTs much sooner. Now there are baits like the Spro, Little John, MDs, and the regulars that will catch fish as well in these colder waters. Like I said, this is a plastic bait, and it does have rattles to it. So that rattle, just a little bit extra noise to it. For some reason in cold water, they really don't like that. And since it's plastic, it has a different action than a balsa wood crankbait would. So it just, I feel like it throws the fish off just a little bit, and you'll get more bites if you're using a balsa wood crankbait. Not saying you won't catch fish on this one, but if I had the choice, I will be throwing a balsa wood crankbait in any water under 50 degrees. And as for the color selection, I keep it very simple with my crankbaits. Obviously, if that water's clear again, I'm going to go with that natural shad color. Anything in the whites, sexy shad, just a plain shad color, anything like that. That's what these fish are going to try and feed on the most, because that's the most available forage this time of year. If the water stains up a little bit, a lot of times in late February, mid-February, you'll start to get that ice melt in the northern states if you're going to be able to fish there. Or towards the south, you'll get spring rains coming in already, and it'll dirty up the water just a little bit. So that's when I'll start going to like a chartreuse color. Still imitates a shad, but it puts off a little bit brighter presentation than this natural shad bait does, and can get more bites when the water's stained. And then the number one color that will start to show up late February going into March is going to be your red crawfish colors. The reason that people use these the most is because of those spring rains. While the crawfish are going to start to come out that time of year as the water's warm, what really happens is the water gets so dirty that this is such a highly contrasting bait, the black and red, that the fish can just find the bait. It's much easier to find that when it doesn't have that much of a vibration to it. They can see that color a little bit better and be able to find your bait and get more bites. It doesn't really imitate crawfish all the time, but it gets you a lot of bites because it's a highly contrasting bait in that dirty water. So if you enjoyed today's video talking about my favorite February baits, go ahead and check this video out where I talked about my favorite January baits, because these will still work as well, especially if you have a little bit colder water than the rest of the country. And if you enjoyed today's video, leave a like down below and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any more of my weekly fishing tips.